Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm Hal Cook from the Department of History, and I want to get this session underway because we want to leave time for discussion at the end. I know that there will be much interest in all three of these papers, and we do have to end before 1 o'clock because I have to run off and teach. So we will stick to time. I would like to introduce all three speakers at once, and then they will follow to speak for 20 minutes, one after another. Then we'll have a discussion at the end. The first speaker is Wim Klooster. He's professor and chair of the history department at Clark University, where he's taught since 2003. His works include a book called Illicit Riches, Dutch Trade in the Caribbean, 1648 to 1795, which was published in 1998, and Revolutions in the Atlantic World, A Comparative History, which was published in 2009, and he has a forthcoming book entitled The Dutch Moment in Atlantic History, which sounds wonderful. His paper today will be on cultivating the transnational sugar business. This is the one you see already. Bertie Mandelblatt will follow. She's assistant professor at the University of Toronto, teaching in the Department of History and the Program for Caribbean Studies. Her research concerns food history, commodity exchanges, and consumption in the French Atlantic world. Her current book project examines global and local scales of the food provisioning of colonial and largely slave plantations of the Franco-Caribbean from the 1620s to the 1780s. Bertie Mandelblatt's recent publications include a number of articles in several journals, including French History and History of European Ideas and History Workshop Journal, as well as chapters in The Political Economy of Empire in the Early Modern World and Handbook of Food History. And the final, her paper will be Early Models of Production. And our third speaker is James Robertson, senior lecturer in the Department of History and Archaeology at the University of the West Indies, Mona, in Kingston, Jamaica. His research interests include early Jamaica, West Indian urban history, and 16th and 17th century London. He is vice president of the Jamaica Historical Society, of the Archaeological Society of Jamaica, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He has a book titled Bone is the Ancient Glory, Spanish Town, Jamaica, from 1534 to 2000. And he's currently writing on the Western design. His title is slightly altered. It will be Out of Many, One Crop, Causes and Consequences of 17th Century Jamaica's Shift to Sugar. Our first speaker is Wim Klooster. Thank you very much, Wim.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, JCB, for organizing this marvelous conference. This paper will investigate the peculiar role that sugar played in the 17th century Dutch Atlantic world. Sugar provided the economic rationale of the Dutch Atlantic, legitimized the conquests of Brazil and Suriname, and led to the Dutch participation in the Atlantic slave trade. The stage, it would seem, was thus set for large-scale Dutch sugar production. Yet, for much of the century, the Dutch were hardly involved in actual production. How can we explain this paradox? Sugar first started arriving in the Low Countries on a regular basis in the mid-16th century as trade between Brazil and the Netherlands was integrated into a commercial axis with Lisbon. The original destination was Antwerp, in the southern Netherlands, but after the Spanish conquest of that port in 1585, which saw many local merchants moved north, trade between the northern Netherlands, the area that would become the Dutch Republic, and Brazil also got underway, keeping to the beaten triangular track. Superior to the Portuguese caravels, which were vulnerable to attacks by English privateers and pirates and which had less capacity, Dutch ships now sailed back and forth to Brazil as well, carrying large amounts of sugar. The 1590s saw the rise of sugar refineries in the northern Netherlands. While there were 3 operating in Rotterdam by 1594, the first reference to so-called sugar bakers in Amsterdam dates from 1597. Amsterdam's sugar refining industry expanded steadily from 3 or 4 bakeries in that year to 25 in 1622, 40 in mid-century, and 50 in 1662, each of which were 5 or 6 stories high by the latter date. The bulk of the finished product was not consumed only in the Dutch Republic, but exported to France, England, Sweden, Denmark, Bohemia, Austria, and various parts of the Holy Roman Empire. After Spanish embargoes had halted the flow of Brazilian sugar to Amsterdam and Middelburg in around the turn of the 17th century, Dutch ships were welcomed back to the Iberian Peninsula during the 12-year truce between the Habsburgs and the Dutch in 1609-1621. But after that truce expired, the Dutch authorities resumed warfare as they extended hostilities to the Americas. No longer keen on retaining a subordinate position in the Brazilian sugar trade, the directors of the West India Company planned to control the Brazil trade in all its aspects: production, trade, and distribution. Their grand design, formulated during one of the first board meetings, included the dispatch of a fleet that was to conquer Brazil's capital of Salvador de Bahia, and another one that targeted Luanda, Portugal's main slave trading port in Africa. Sugar was what the directors were after. Occupying Bahia would enable the capture of the sugar region of northeastern Brazil, while dominance in Luanda would ensure a steady migration of Africans to work the plantations. The West India Company soon prepared a massive invasion of Salvador de Bahia, Brazil's capital city, which was successfully executed in 1624. But after just 1 year, an Iberian fleet dispelled the Dutch, and that's what you can see in this illustration, and the Dutch, whose participation in the Brazilian sugar trade was therefore blocked. Privateers, nonetheless, guaranteed that the flow of Brazilian sugar to the Republic continued. Shipping between Portugal and Brazil suffered tremendously at the hands of these privateers, who captured 80 Portuguese vessels in the Brazil trade in 1625-26 alone. In 1630, the West India Company invaded Brazil again. The focus was now on Pernambuco, the captaincy in the north that boasted 150 sugar plantations and that annually sent about 120 ships filled with sugar to Portugal. One West India Company report argued that the Dutch were better placed than the Portuguese to run the sugar trade, since they could offer European goods at lower prices and were exempt from tolls and tithes. Besides, invading and consolidating Pernambuco would not be a tall order. Although the invasion succeeded, and the Dutch established their headquarters at Recife, and here you see what's sometimes called the double town of Recife and Mauritsstad, connected by a bridge, Recife to the south, Mauritsstad named for the later governor in the north. So although the invasion succeeded and the Dutch established the headquarters in Recife, it would take 5 years before the Dutch controlled a large sugar-producing area. Besides, only during the 10-year period between 1635 and 45 did they hang on to this sugar-producing area. And even then, they could not reap the full benefits of their conquest because of the ongoing war with their enemies in Brazil. By 1645, sugar cultivation in Dutch Brazil shrank dramatically as the vast territory under Dutch rule was reduced to a small coastal area after a Luso-Brazilian rebellion that had broken out. The loss was never reversed, and the Dutch finally surrendered what remained of their colony in 1654. In the meantime, their control of sugar lands had induced the Dutch to involve themselves in the Atlantic slave trade. Setting up the slave trade had been an agenda item at the second board meeting of the West India Company. But it was not until 1634 when the Dutch assumed control of Pernambuco's sugar industry that the need for slave labor made itself felt in Dutch America. Consequently, imports from Africa were required, and in order to secure a steady supply of African workers, it was necessary, the West India Company said, that the Dutch themselves started organizing the voyages, which was preferable to dependence on foreign merchants. In 1635, therefore, the company board gave orders to ship captains to start the slave trade on the African coast, where the Dutch, by now, possessed a few trading centers. The conquest of Elmina, Luanda, and Sao Tome within a 4-year span was also connected to Brazil's labor concerns. The revolt of the Portuguese in Brazil in 1645 that ended Dutch control of the sugar industry in northern Brazil was itself connected to the slave trade. Featured prominently among the leaders of the revolt were loser Brazilian sugar lords, owners of large plantations who were notoriously short of liquid assets. Even for the settlement of their debts, they had to mortgage all their property, the sugar mills, the draft oxen, and the slaves. Under the circumstances, the Dutch allowed them to buy slaves on credit, a solution that would become commonplace in the French and British Caribbean sugar islands in the 18th century. Erupting in 1645, the very year that the sugar lords were bound to start paying off their debts, the rebellion precluded the payment of debts worth over 4.6 million guilders, most of which had been contracted for the purchase of slaves. I'll give you a few images of the sugar industry in Brazil in this period, sketched first by Frans Post on the ground in Brazil and then later made into paintings after his return to Amsterdam. This is the image that Stuart Schwartz showed last night as well. And here you have an image of the Recife, a slave market under Dutch rule, and it's very clear where the slaves are located here. Let me quickly go back to the images of the sugar industry, because I'm going to talk about that now. If the Dutch, for years, had carried out a scorched earth policy at the expense of their enemies' sugar estates before 1645, the roles were now reversed, as the enemy soldiers burned large sugar fields and mills and smashed sugar cauldrons and other equipment to pieces. Nonetheless, Dutch metropolitan ports were not left without Brazilian sugar. Once again, privateers, especially those from the province of Zeeland, filled the need for Brazilian sugar by engaging in maritime warfare. The Zeeland privateers had made a living going after ships from pro-Spanish Dunkirk, but had no means of support after the capitulation of Dunkirk in late 1646. They now found a new vocation in going after Portuguese ships, contributing to the lion's share of the 220 Portuguese vessels lost to the Dutch in 1647 and 48. This is a tremendous number because these are ocean-going ships. And it came down to about 3/4 of all ships sailing between Portugal and Brazil in these years. By 1652, however, hardly any Dutch privateers were left attacking Portuguese ships bound for Brazil. Not only did Portugal introduce an efficient convoy system for its sugar-carrying ships, in July of that year, the first Anglo-Dutch War broke out, which enabled Zeelanders to stay close to home and target their English neighbors. The Brazilian coast south of Recife was soon safe again for Portuguese shipping, allowing a fleet of 30 sail to leave from Bahia to Portugal in May 1653. We may wonder how much expertise in sugar cultivation the Dutch gathered during the decade that they possessed an area in Brazil dedicated to the production of the crop. The Luso-Brazilian planter Gaspar Dias Ferreira wrote in 1645, "Show me the Hollander who up to the present day in Pernambuco was a workman in making sugar, or who wished to learn it, or any other position in the sugar mill. There are but few Flemings, as he called them, who devote themselves to the sugar industry or to the maintenance of the mills in Brazil, and only rarely do they own them. And thus, both the blacks and the sugars have to pass through the hands of the Portuguese." Agriculture was not a major pursuit in the Dutch Atlantic. home to colonial populations that were small by any standard. While the New Netherlanders dedicated themselves to cereal subsistence farming, the settlers of most Dutch Caribbean islands and Guyana cultivated tobacco before 1650, although in amounts too small to be quoted on the Amsterdam staple market. Only in Brazil did large-scale cash crop production exist of sugar and tobacco, predominantly, though, undertaken by the conquered Luso-Brazilian residents. But when the High Council in Brazil put the plantations, most of which were in Pernambuco, up for auction in 1637-38, Dutch Calvinists and Portuguese Jews eagerly bought the estates. They were, however, only able to run sugar mills by relying on the expertise of Portuguese agents and the lavradores, the sugarcane cultivators, some of whom owned slaves and land, although most were tenants or sharecroppers who leased land from mill owners. Ultimately, the sugar planters in Dutch Brazil did not derive much benefit from their new property because even in the short period, until the start of the revolt, Dutch Brazil produced far below its capacity. Nevertheless, some Jews and Christians did leave Brazil in 1654 with expertise in sugar growing. They included men who would continue to practice this trade in foreign colonies. Such was the case with Jan van Oel, who co-owned a sugar mill in Brazil in 1641 and was listed in 1660 as co-owner of a sugar estate in Martinique with 25 slaves. Another former resident of Dutch Brazil, Pierre Lermite, owned 3 sugar estates in Martinique along with his son in 1671. At least 26 Dutchmen and 6 former residents of Dutch Brazil moved to Guadeloupe, where almost all were listed as habitants or sucriers, so sugar growers, in the island's censuses. These men formed a very small group of experts. There is no evidence that the planters in the new Dutch colonies in Guyana and the Caribbean all hailed from Brazil, and yet they did introduce the required expertise in these colonies. So these new planters most likely had familiarized themselves directly or indirectly with sugar production in a more or less superficial way in Brazil, or it had been their relatives. The achievements of the men responsible for sugar planting in Dutch America in the shadow of Dutch Brazil were once again challenged by international warfare. Just when sugar began to thrive in the Caribbean and Guyana by the mid-1660s, the Second Anglo-Dutch War jeopardized production. There is no doubt that the English targeted sugar works throughout Dutch America during this war. The expedition by English buccaneers that left Jamaica in July 1665 to the adjacent Dutch colonies of St. Eustatius and Saba was in this respect exceedingly successful. After the invaders had engaged in their customary sacks, they had, after all, been recruited with that promise, the expedition's leaders had the Dutch residents abducted to St. Martin unless they swore an oath of allegiance to the English king. The dismantlement of both colonies' infrastructure was equally momentous. Copper, stills, and some 900 slaves were removed and largely disembarked at Jamaica, and there they must have given a boost to the budding sugar economy. The next target in the Dutch Caribbean during this war was Tobago, another Dutch colony, which was captured 2 months later by 80 English privateers. And the same scenario here unfolded as in St. Eustatius and Saba, as the invaders destroyed all 18 sugar plantations and everything that could not be carried off and was dragged away, especially the coppers, the sugar mills, kettles, and pans. The action then shifted to the mainland of South America, where troops from Barbados overran the Dutch colonies on Guyana's Pomeroon and Essequibo rivers in January 1666, followed in March by the English capture of yet another Dutch Guyana colony, and once again, slaves and copper were the main booty. On their part, the Dutch conquered the English sugar colony of Suriname in 1667, where sugar planting faced various obstacles. The knowledge of curing sugar left much to be desired. Cattle to drive the mills was virtually absent in the startup years, and many planters used train oil or paraffin in processing sugar, which created a bad taste and a negative reputation for the colony. As late as 1674, an English observer noted that the Dutch in Suriname, quote, have not the skill of making sugar, but hire the very raggedest English, end of quote. Not until the mid-1680s had the necessary improvements been introduced in the manufacturing process. Still, the future of sugar cultivation looked bright in Suriname soon after the Dutch conquest, when the planters wrote a petition to the Netherlands in which they mentioned the existence of 52 sugar plantations with 2,500 black and 500 Indian slaves. How am I doing on time? This is not the whole story. The Dutch role in sugar's triumphal march throughout the Atlantic world was not confined to their own colonies. Their contribution to several English and French islands in the Caribbean has frequently been emphasized. Here, as early in Brazil, they cultivated the transnational sugar business. The role of the Dutch has, however, often been exaggerated. The Dutch are the missing link, the explanation why almost overnight Barbados was able to start what is sometimes called a sugar revolution. Having acquired control of Brazil's sugar cultivation, the Dutch supposedly transferred their capital, know-how, technology, etc. to the foreign West Indies, and they thus helped unleash the sugar revolution which originated in Barbados, and they did it deliberately. Dutch ships, to be true, frequently called at the English colonies, supplying a myriad of commodities on credit. Some Amsterdam merchants maintained a factor on Barbados, likewise, and some planters on Barbados used an agent in Amsterdam. When no more than a few English ships appeared in the West Indies during the Civil War, the English Civil War, Dutch vessels and their cargoes often saved the day. It is also clear that horses that served as draft animals on the plantations often came off Dutch ships. But it is doubtful whether capital goods, such as sugar mills and cauldrons, were supplied in great number. There is in fact hardly any proof for this hypothesis. On the contrary, the Dutch archives reveal that textiles and provisions predominated in the holds of Caribbean-bound ships, and that hardware formed only a negligible part of outgoing cargoes. A crucial ingredient in the theory about the Dutch transfer of the sugar industry is the volume of their slave supplies. And evidence is lacking for the traditional hypothesis that the Dutch sold large numbers of Africans in the early stages of English sugar cultivation. During Barbados' crucial startup years as a sugar producer, beginning in 1639, the Dutch were still struggling to send slaves to Brazil. Besides, the Dutch slave trade was a monopoly of the West India Company, whose board did everything in its power to send bonded Africans to its prize colony in Brazil. The company only allowed shipments of Africans to foreign colonies after the start of the Brazilian Revolt in 1645, by which time sugar cultivation on Barbados had taken off. Few West India Company ships or Dutch smugglers sailed to Barbados with human cargoes in the years ahead. Only 3 cases have been documented for the mid-1640s. Furthermore, the capacity of the Dutch to supply slaves was seriously affected by the Dutch loss of Luanda, the main source of African labor, in 1648. Not until the latter days of the Dutch period in Brazil are there signs of a restructuring of the slave trade that benefited the English colonies. And by then, the enforcement of the Navigation Acts made shipments to these colonies a hazardous affair. The Dutch role in the French Caribbean is a different matter. French historiography rightly credits the Dutch for having helped Guadeloupe and Martinique through the difficult early plantation years. Guadeloupe's governor remarked in 1665 that many of the best sugar plantations owed their existence to the advances made by the Dutch. No fewer than 637 residents on the island were indebted to these foreigners. Similarly, the arriving Lieutenant General of the French West Indies found Martinique, the other island, excessively indebted to the Dutch. The Dutch almost completely controlled the slave trade to the French colonies in the 1660s. The sole 2 French vessels arriving with Africans in this decade were actually both Dutch vessels in disguise, having first left from Dutch ports. The Dutch supplied all the planters needed to start the sugar revolution. And in addition to slaves, they provided credit, imported horses for use on the sugar plantations, and introduced technical know-how. Curaçao contributed to St. Christophe's, so the French portion of St. Kitts' development, supplying horses that drove 5 of the 6 sugar mills by 1658, and continued to ship large numbers of oxen and horses to the French colonies until 1670. Artisans who had left Dutch Brazil in 1654 taught the French how to assemble the metal cylinders that crushed the cane and the boilers in which the cane juice was purified. They also instructed the French how to make the mold in which the sugar syrup crystallized and how to make white sugar from muscovado, the unrefined brown sugar. The foundation, 2 minutes left, okay. Let me quickly then hop to the conclusion so that the other panelists won't suffer. The hope and expectation among senior Dutch magistrates at the end of the 12-year truce with Spain in 1621 that sugar could sustain a new colony in Brazil was therefore never really fulfilled. The war with Habsburg Spain in Brazil dragged on, and Dutch fortunes were even reversed in 1645 with the outbreak of a revolt of the Luso-Brazilian population. Since it also interfered with Dutch sugar planting in the Americas after the demise of Dutch Brazil in 1654, warfare must count as the main reason why there was such a gap between Dutch intentions and achievements. While sugar cultivation quickly took root in both the insular Dutch Caribbean and the mainland of Guyana in the late 1650s and early 1660s, the Second Anglo-Dutch War nipped the promising sugar industries in the bud as English invaders captured most Dutch colonies and extended their warfare to the economic realm by stealing copper and other industrial hardware, as well as enslaved African plantation workers. While Dutch sugar colonies thus suffered on the hand of their enemies, those belonging to France and England were flourishing. Nor were the Dutch distant onlookers as these foreign colonies blossomed into modern economic laboratories, supplying slaves, draft animals, and know-how to the French during the crucial decade of the 1660s. After French officials closed the door to the Dutch, their energies were finally channeled into sugar cultivation in Suriname. Thank you.
Well, first I'd like to repeat the thanks that we've heard so far towards the conference organizers. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and very much looking forward to the kinds of conversations that hope happen over the next couple of days. And I'm particularly pleased to be here because it's kind of an unusual situation that one finds oneself in when the paper that you're about to give speaks so clearly to previous papers that deal with overlapping similar kinds of topics. And I'm thinking particularly of Stuart Schwartz's keynote speech yesterday, but also the paper we just heard from Wim Klooster, and I'm hoping this can be quite productive in terms of generating discussion. Writing at the end of the 17th century, the Dominican missionary Jean-Baptiste Labat described the timing of the turn toward sugar production that had taken place on the principal French-occupied islands in the Lesser Antilles, Saint-Christophe, which the French shared with the English in this period, Martinique and Guadeloupe, in an unusually succinct manner. He wrote, and I quote, "The English were the first in a position to make sugar on Saint-Christophe. The histories of their colonies indicate that this took place in 1643. The French on the same island were not long in following them. Sugar wasn't made on Guadeloupe until 1648, under the direction of the Dutch, who found refuge there after their flight from Brazil. Sugar was made a little later on Martinique." Yeah, do let me know if you can't hear me. "Sugar was made a little later on Martinique and on Barbados about the same time as on Saint-Christophe," end quote. This short passage marks Labat's contribution to debates about the factors that contributed to this shift from tobacco to sugar, factors that include the transatlantic, intercolonial, and even, if we can anachronistically evoke the nation state, transnational circulation of capital and technical expertise in the mid-17th century. That these debates over how English and French colonies of the Lesser Antilles made the transition to the sugar production that would define their explosive growth in later periods, and over the role of the Dutch in this transition are still ongoing, is a testament to both the pivotal importance of this transition and of the competing and contradictory accounts of precisely how this took place. As an example, in a recent chapter on the Dutch slave trade, and drawing on work from John McCusker and Russell Menard, Jelmer Vos, David Eltis, and David Richardson question, in their words, quote, "the traditional interpretation that places the Dutch at the center of early Caribbean sugar revolution." And I think we've just heard another framing of whether or not the Dutch should really be placed in the middle of this history. But just a quick summary of this traditional interpretation would run along the lines of the passage of Labat's that I cited above, that after having occupied Brazil on and off since 1626, during which time they were involved in the Brazilian sugar industry, the Dutch were expelled by the Portuguese, who reclaimed Brazil in 1654, at which time the Dutch sailed northwards to the Lesser Antilles in the Eastern Caribbean. And this is a map drawn from Labat's own work of the Caribbean. and this is a little bit more detailed map of the Eastern Caribbean, and were responsible for the full-blown launch of sugar industries of the major English and French-occupied islands, namely, as we've heard, Barbados, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. McCusker and Menard's contention corroborates the work of other economic historians, such as P.C. Emmer, who argue that as investors and merchants, the role of the Dutch, the role of the English in supporting the transition to sugar was as great as that of the Dutch, and in fact, the Dutch role has been overplayed. In examining this pivotal moment in the early Atlantic circulation of capital, technical knowledge, and expertise, the questions that I would like to raise in this paper about the role of the Dutch in the launch of the sugar industry in the Lesser Antilles of the 17th century, drawing on the case of the French islands in particular, concern the parameters implied by the very assertion that they did play or did not play a role. When we refer to the Dutch, who do we mean? Or only the Dutch who set sail from Recife to the Lesser Antilles in 1654, the relevant actors in this history of the Atlantic diffusion of sugar technology and expertise? And second, what do these roles really entail? I would like to argue that as important as the financial and mercantile aspects of sugar production and trade were, and leaving aside for the moment the broader dominance of the Dutch in Atlantic trade and shipping, including that of slaves, and in the refining and trade within Europe of sugar, the impact of the Dutch and those who accompanied them on the wholesale launch of sugar production in the Lesser Antilles must be considered in a context that is both wider ranging and more precise. That of their role of carriers of new entrenched systems of plantation management, including the management of enslaved workers. This model of the plantations that had developed in Brazil over the previous several decades, including such diverse elements as technical innovations to sugar milling that developed in the first quarter of the 17th century, and the organization of slave subsistence, was to prove an exceedingly powerful influence on the evolution of British and French plantation in the Eastern Caribbean. In this first part of the paper, I'd like to focus on the question of which Dutch were most at stake in these debates over 1654. As it happens in the French case, the Dutch were involved in sugar production far earlier than that date, for reasons that speak to the position of the Dutch in an expansion of trade in the early modern period that was, in fact, more global than Atlantic in scope. The first record of sugar cane being cultivated in the French Antilles is, in fact, the 6-year monopoly awarded in 1639 by Governor du Parquet to Daniel Trézel, a Fleming who had lived in Rouen before coming to the Antilles, on all sugar produced on Martinique if he would begin a plantation. Concurrently in the same year, Daniel Trézel's Samuel Trézel bought a plantation on the island of Guadeloupe from then Governor Lolive, and began to clear the land for a sugar plantation, building the first sugar mill there at the end of 1639 or the beginning of 1640. That is, within 4 years of formal French colonization of the two islands, which happened in 1635, sugar was envisaged as an export crop. In fact, it had been envisaged as an export crop from the beginning, but these plans to develop it were concretized by two Dutchmen. As it happens in the cases of both father and son, these precocious sugar-making projects failed within a few years, with neither sugar mill functioning past the early 1640s. Although, again, in both cases, sugar production just simply shifted to other colonists of the two islands, notably Governor Huel on Guadeloupe, who's widely credited to being involved in the first serious way in sugar. The Compagnie des Îles d'Amérique, which was the chartered French company that was responsible for the development of French colonies in this period in the Caribbean, records a 1641 disbursement to Samuel Trézel of compensation for the costs that he had undertaken to construct his mill. The reason for the failure of these operations, incidentally, are understood to be the general downturn in sugar prices that struck mid-century, and Stuart Schwartz talked about this decline in sugar prices at this period. So not only should we understand the Dutch role as including Dutch involvement that preceded 1654 in the French case, but in dissecting the social category of the Dutch, we need to consider the importance of those who involuntarily accompanied the Dutch in their 1654 flight, and whose sugar-making knowledge had a critical impact on the development of French sugar-making. In his classic work on the Dutch in Brazil, Charles Boxer long ago underlined the extent to which the Dutch in Brazil had not been active innovators of Portuguese sugar-making. And Stuart Schwartz talked about this yesterday, and Wim Kloosters certainly talked about this just a few minutes ago. Making use of key Portuguese innovations, such as the 3 vertical roller mills, and the battery of 6 cauldrons, but not introducing any new ones. And these are actually images that I believe are in the exhibition. I haven't had a chance to go through it yet, but I believe the originals of these images we can look at in more detail in the exhibition itself. And indeed, as people have underlined already, in fact, the Dutch relied heavily on the Portuguese themselves as factors and smallholders. But not only the Portuguese, but also on a group of people who were perfectly placed to understand Portuguese techniques and who were experienced in their operation, that is, enslaved Afro-Brazilians, or enslaved Brazilians of African or mixed-race background. And although the Luso-Portuguese stayed in Brazil after 1654, the Dutch brought with them their slaves on their journey into the Eastern Caribbean. In his 1667 account of the French Caribbean colonies, Jean-Baptiste Dutertre, the Herodotus of the Antilles, as he's known, and a co-religionist of Jean-Baptiste Labat, reveals in edifying detail the result of this migration of enslaved Afro-Brazilians. And here their narrative of this moment of transition should be told, I think, in Dutertre's own words, although I'm paraphrasing them. According to Dutertre, the Dutch expelled from Brazil arrived on Martinique in 1654. They would have been welcomed by Governor Duparquet, except for the opposition of the Jesuit fathers, who refused their disembarkation because it was a mix of Protestants and Jews. Governor Huel on Guadeloupe had had the news both of the Dutch expulsion from Brazil and of their refused entry to Martinique from a ship that had come from the northern coast of South America. There's a huge amount of antipathy, hostility, and competition between the French islands in this period. And Huel correctly anticipated their subsequent arrival on his island. He welcomed the refugees with open arms. Several other Dutch vessels then met the first one on Guadeloupe, bringing the total number of Dutch who settled on the island to over 900 persons, including slaves. Duparquet was in a rage at having lost this opportunity, which caused no small conflict with the resident Jesuits. He was, however, able to make good on his loss as a Dutch ship carrying, and I quote, the debris of the Dutch colony, end quote, of over 300 people. Several Flemish families, a good number of slaves, and 7 or 8 Jews, and that's a quote. This ship arrived on Martinique subsequently. Meanwhile, Governor Huel on Guadeloupe was relishing his good luck. Of the 900 who had settled on the island, there were, in Dutertre's words, and I quote, several who understood perfectly the functioning of sugar works, and Huel met 2 slaves, one of whom knew how to make the forms or sugar molds, which the Dutch had previously needed to import from Holland at great expense, and the other who knew how to prepare the earth used in sugar works for the refining of the sugar. And we've heard about both of these things very briefly in the previous paper, but just to elucidate a little bit, or to expand on this a little bit, the 2 tasks that Dutertre identifies here would be key to the way that that French sugar production in particular developed over the next 150 years in the Lesser Antilles. While the sugar produced and processed on English islands, other than Barbados, which largely resemble the French islands, remained at the Muscovado quality, the French continued this rudimentary processing by claying their sugar. And this image, again, I think there's originals of these in the exhibition that we will be able to see, shows the 6 cauldron method that had been developed in Brazil and subsequently brought up and actually refined by Labat. Certainly in the French Caribbean, Labat is attributed to the battery of 6 cauldrons. And in the lower image, we see the molds that the Muscovado sugar is poured into. And so just briefly, each of the 6 cauldrons, it ranges from largest to smallest in size, and this juice of sugarcane, once it's crushed, moves through the 6 cauldrons, getting thicker and thicker until it reaches the final smallest cauldron, at which case it could be shipped in a very wet, kind of greasy, reddish-brown state across the Atlantic as Muscovado. And what the French did in order to clay their sugar, sucre terré, or clayed sugar in English, was to then pour it into the conical molds that we see at the bottom and place a layer of wet clay on the top of this Muscovado. The water from the wet clay would drain through the conical molds, which is why you see the 2-part mold. So the water pulling the impurities in the form of kind of a liquefied molasses would be pulled into the bottom part, and this resulted in a whiter, more refined sugar, which was then subsequently dried for a couple of weeks and broken up and shipped. This drier, whiter sugar sold for at least 50% more, and in often cases a lot more than 50% more on international markets. The debates over the development of colonial refineries in the French islands that peaked with Colbert's reversal in the early 1680s of earlier decisions, debates that starkly divided colonial interests from metropolitan interests and led to the growth of the French refining industry along the Loire Valley and in Marseille, had their source in French colonists' insistence on continuing to clay their sugar throughout the 17th and 18th century. That this technique was introduced to Martinique and Guadeloupe as a result of the Dutch arrival seems incontrovertible, but in fact Dutertre's passage reveals more about the agency and autonomy of slaves responsible for the diffusion of technical expertise than it does about any particular talent of the Dutch. The role of enslaved workers and of their intra-American forced migration as vectors of the spread of technical and other kinds of knowledge is an understudied dimension of the circulation of ideas in the Atlantic world. But the 900 Dutch and enslaved Afro-Brazilian refugees who arrived in Guadeloupe and 300 in Martinique brought with them more than Brazilian sugar-making techniques. And here I'd like to address questions that concern broader ideas of plantation management, including the management of enslaved populations. These planters brought with them the Brazilian model of the organization of slave life, in which slaves were wholly responsible for their own subsistence, both food and clothing, and were given a day a week on which to work for themselves, to cultivate food crops. Again, both Dutertre and Labat attribute the early provision ground system, the free Saturday plus plot of land on which to grow crops that developed in the French colonies, to this Brazilian model. And here I quote Dutertre, who says, "The Dutch who were chased from Recife, who have made themselves at home in Guadeloupe and Martinique, govern their slaves in the Brazilian manner and give them neither food nor clothes nor anything else, but they leave them the time to work on their own account the Saturday of each week, for this reason giving them a quantity of land on which to plant manioc, potatoes, and peas." Many French, believing there to be gains made by relieving themselves of the responsibility of feeding and caring for their slaves, would like to imitate the Dutch. But these slaves, unused to the system, are obliged to steal from their masters, as well as from their neighbors, in order to find food on which to survive. As this passage describes, from the very beginnings of large-scale sugar cultivation and the development of the plantation system, the Brazilian model of slave subsistence, which entailed an autonomy for slaves that could be both liberating and hazardous, took hold and persisted. To clarify the distinction between the two systems, French metropolitan and colonial injunctions from the beginning of colonization envisaged a system in which planters maintained complete responsibility over this sphere of activity. They organized the centralized allocation of plantation land, the surveillance of slave labor, the centralized storage and distribution of foodstuffs, and the quantity of provisions cultivated and distributed. To this end, metropolitan and colonial administrators passed law after law ordering colonists to plant subsistence crops for themselves and their slaves, namely manioc and plantain. Indeed, one of the first items of Moreau de Sainte-Marie's massive 5-volume collection of legislation related to Saint-Domingue and other French islands is the Ordonnance of 1648, passed by the governor of Martinique, commanding that, quote, "habitants plant and cultivate foodstuffs to guarantee the food supply of their slaves, and that militia officers be employed to survey and report on this activity," end quote. This injunction was repeated and expanded in 1670, and in fact took various forms over the next 125 years. Indeed, this predilection towards centralized food cultivation and distribution was codified in the 1685 Code Noir, 8 articles of which address the provision of food to slaves. Article 22 of the Code Noir in particular reads, and I quote, "Masters are charged with furnishing their slaves aged 10 and above the following weekly ration: 2½ pots of manioc flour according to local measurement, or 3 cassavas, weighing a minimum of 2½ pounds each, or the equivalent. With 2 pounds of salt beef, or 3 pounds of fish, or the equivalent, and with furnishing children up to the age of 10 years, half of the ration described above," end quote. This body of legislation was heavily resisted by planters who preferred it instead to follow what Dutertre called the Brazilian system, in which this responsibility was largely relinquished to slaves themselves. And in so doing, planters were applying a system which the slaves also favored, seeing it as benefiting their own self-interest. There's little to no evidence that planters ever followed any of the numerous directives commanding them to furnish their slaves with food provision. And the ongoing crisis of slave malnutrition and high mortality rates due to the generally nutritionally inadequate dietary regime and insufficiency of food provision continued on the French Caribbean islands, and not only on the French Caribbean islands, throughout the old regime. The conclusions that I'd like to draw from this short examination of the Dutch role in the transition to sugar in the Les Antilles are twofold. First, I think we need to unpack what we mean by the Dutch. As contemporaneous accounts make clear, the role of the Dutch has perhaps obscured the roles of the true skilled cultivators of sugarcane and refiners of sugar, the enslaved Afro-Brazilians who were brought by force to the Caribbean by the Dutch. These men and women clearly played active roles in the diffusion of sugar-making expertise that decisively shaped how the sugar industry developed in the French Caribbean and elsewhere. We need to integrate more fully the intra-American as well as the transatlantic circulation of slaves into the economic history of the Atlantic world, not only as the producers of commodities and of commodities themselves, as well as the consumers of commodities, but also as skilled actors and as carriers of valuable technical knowledge. So this is a map taken from the slave trade database that shows kind of the general themes of the transatlantic movement of slaves, but of course what it doesn't address is the intra-American movement of slaves. Secondly, I argue that historical narratives that privilege the Dutch as the principal actors in the diffusion of technical and organizational knowledge as regards to the plantation complex neglects the broader geopolitical context of fierce and militarized intra-European competition for control over the emerging wealth being made from the development and exploitation of export commodities produced, in Stuart Schwartz's words, in plantation America. In the 17th century Atlantic world of fractured and experimental colonial settlements and porous boundaries of empire characterized by the mobility of certain segments of colonial populations and rapidly developing capitalism, the full-blown transition to sugar production in the Lesser Antilles based on Brazilian models reflect the restless and continuous search for imperial profitability that both preceded and followed it. Thank you.
Right. Out of many, one crop. Causes and consequences of the 17th century Jamaica's shift to sugar. At the start of the 21st century, sugar growing is in decline in many Caribbean islands. One consequence of this shift is that the inevitability of King Sugar's reshaping of island societies no longer appears so self-evident. Looking back, we can now reconsider how the trajectory began and the ways that the bitter weed of commercial sugar, with the slave society and the callous plantation economics it encouraged, all took root in Jamaica. Richard Dunn's and Russell Menard's evaluations of the processes which helped sugar become the dominant crop in Barbados in the 1650s before being transferred to successive English-controlled islands offer us a very solid foundation. These trends paralleled and then reinforced broader social shifts as islands' labor forces changed from indentured Europeans to enslaved Africans. And popular books like Matthew Parker's The Sugar Barons seek to shift the narrative away from an older imperial histories or to induce a greater post-colonial shock. But they continue to delineate the 17th century merely as roots of 18th and early 19th century societies. The 17th century's changes' own immediate context rarely received the same assessment, except, of course, yesterday and this morning. A narrative focusing on Jamaica is also likely to be out of step with most of the 17th century England's other West Indian possessions. The island was bigger, certainly, with opportunities to sustain a wider range of crops, and it was a later acquisition, seized in 1655, a generation after those settled in the 1620s and 30s. Still more, while the Eastern Caribbean islands the English took over were depopulated or only housed as fairly small Kalinago populations, Jamaica had been occupied by a long-established Spanish colony. The tenacious resistance sustained by the Spanish settlers and their African Jamaican allies for 5 years meant the English occupiers had a rough transition. Raiding parties inflicted extensive destruction, while abandoned fields soon reverted to bush. Sugar's future predominance was hardly self-evident when the English conquered Jamaica. The marginal Spanish colony they invaded had retreated from the very substantial investments in water-driven sugar mills undertaken by leading members of the first generation of Jamaica's conquistadores. Labor-intensive estates were abandoned, as in many of the Spaniards' other colonial Caribbean territories. The 16th century saw a shift away from sugar towards alternative crops like ginger or cattle ranching, or else felling tropical hardwoods. These could be gathered using smaller labor forces, which was a significant concern given the precipitous decline in the Taino labor force. Jamaica had not followed Spanish Trinidad, another marginal island colony, when during the 1580s and 90s, settlers developed an Amerindian crop, tobacco, which flourished in the smuggled trade with English and Dutch ships. Late 16th century Jamaica's exports were more limited. Privateers could snatch cargoes of hides, a zealous governor worried over illegal imports of dyewoods, and officials in Cartagena saw the island as a route for bypassing customs duties on enslaved Africans. In the mid-1630s, royal officials made recommendations for developing the island if the Columbus family's hereditary proprietorship was revoked. Their proposals all led with upgrading the island's fortifications. Economic recommendations varied. Several enthused about Jamaica's pimento. One commented that the island's plains and valleys were suitable for cocoa. Another suggested reviving a pearl fishery in today's Kingston Harbor. Columbus's heirs, the island's hands-off proprietors, agreed on one of these suggestions. The island remained unfortified, pimento continued to be gathered wild, and nothing came with the pearl fishery project. But cocoa was introduced. During the 1640s, as Trinidad's farmers transitioned from tobacco to cocoa, substantial effort went into establishing cocoa walks in Jamaica, which started to yield profits. In a breakdown of the 40,950 pesos of annual revenue that the Columbus family received from Jamaica before the English invasion, 20% came from customs duties. Their estates provided the rest. This list led with 29% generated by the plantation of cocoa trees on the Columbus estate at Juanaboa. Otherwise, ranching contributed 30%, two sugar mills at Ligony added a further 20%, urban property rents only contributed 2%. These figures suggest the agricultural balance was changing. While in 1655, when the English landed, there were only 7 sugar mills on the island. This was not what the invaders had expected. We have scant notions how the English made the initial transition to farming in Jamaica. Initially, the occupying army, as a contemporary author protested, starved in a cook's shop. There were multiple misconceptions. The seeds Cromwell's council shipped out in response to the news of the conquest, 20 pounds each of turnip, carrot, and parsnip, along with further bags of lettuce, spinach, and parsley, might have worked if the English had occupied the mountaintops that their maroon antagonists occupied, rather than the lowland fields they were in. Instead, these seedlings, along with whatever other crops the soldiers planted in the savannas they assumed were old Amerindian fields, but were hard-pan clay, all withered. Food ran short. A succession of optimistic official reports stressed efforts to grow provisions, though generally these comments preface urgent requests for shipments of provisions from England or New England. Alongside such activities, however, both sides sought export crops too. Complaining after a debacle in 1657, the ringleader among Spanish Governor de Yassi's mutinous subordinates protested at the governor's spending his time selling sugar and employing the enslaved Africans with his group to gather pimento and cocoa. Among the English, the first reference to a locally grown export crop concerned tobacco. By 1659, the range of locally grown produce requiring export licenses was wider, still including tobacco, but adding cedar boards and consignments of sugar and cocoa. Most of these last looked to be from the cocoa walks the Columbus family had established at Juanaboa, upstream from Spanish Town. That's the capital of the island. English place names current in the early 1660s, like 16-Mile Walk, the 5-Mile Walk, and the later Cocoa Walk Path, testify to their scale. By 1660, Jamaican chocolate was already an eminently marketable commodity, and there should be an exhibit to going around very slowly of Jamaican chocolate, which I would like back. The advertisements were fly-posted across London. It was the Viagra of the 1660s. While Henry Stubb the ex-radical chaplain to Jamaica's first royal governor, busied himself compiling a guide to preparing these new beans, engaging such tricky questions as whether a chocolatier would want a marble or a heatable cast iron grinding board. In the 1660s, cocoa looked likely to offer the newly established coffee a run for its money as the elite's social drink of choice. And unlike all the other English, French, and Dutch island settlements, Jamaica, as a former Spanish colony, was already growing cocoa plants. At this juncture, Jamaica was no monocrop economy. As the island was desperately short of cash, the first meeting of the governor and council of the new royal colony established set rates for tobacco, cocoa, and sugar, which creditors were obliged to accept as equivalents for cash. Sugar was valued at 25 shillings a hundredweight. Cocoa and tobacco were both set at 4 pennies a pound, so 37 shillings and 3 pence a hundredweight. By the end of the next month, the council extended their proclamation to cover cotton, indigo, or any other commodity. Subsequent interventions by the governor and council demonstrate where tensions occurred, and a need to restrain local sugar prices so that island slaveholders could purchase sufficient sugar to improve their enslaved people's diet shows the social cost of too much of the island's sugar output being exported. By 1667, English Jamaica had 119 plantations, divided among 40 for cocoa, 19 for indigo, 57 on sugar, and 3 for cotton. Over the next 3 years, the number of sugar plantations increased to 60, and clearly Vim's involuntary imports of technology would have helped that score. And boosters stated the quality of Jamaican sugar was better than Barbados's, earning premium rates from English merchants. But this was not the island's preeminent crop. By 1670, there were also 60 indigo works, proportionally the largest increase. Meanwhile, the case against encouraging further sugar growing in Jamaica was articulated in 1671 during discussions in London between the president of the Board of Trade and leading absentee Barbados planters and merchants, who claimed that as sugar cannot be had without employing many Negro servants, that therefore Jamaica cannot be used for that purpose, because being large and full of woods and bogs, the Negroes are apt to run away. They therefore asserted that Jamaica is only considerable for the cocoa trade. Jamaica's chocolate should complement Barbados's sugar. Cocoa was indeed the principal and most beneficial commodity of the isle, with 60 cocoa walks in production and another 60 planted. Richard Bloom's 1672 description of Jamaica waxed enthusiastic, prophesying that in time it will become the only noted place for that commodity in the world. The promise is extended further. There was no risk of overproduction, as the Spaniards alone were enough to take the product of the isle. Through the 1670s, descriptions of Jamaica, printed and manuscript, incorporated an itemized set of estimates for the costs necessary to establish a cocoa walk on a new grant of land, compiled by Governor Sir Thomas Modiford in August 1667. Prospective settlers were advised they would need an investment of £500 and should be prepared to wait 6 years from first surveying their land to their walk bearing a crop of cocoa. And you may recall in Dr. Hall's paper earlier, the figures for sugar in Barbados were a much bigger ground sum of £3,000. So this is a much cheaper grub stake. Even with cautions about the costs of deaths and runaways and the note that the price would not always rise, Modiford's breakdown of cocoa planting promised long-term prosperity for finite initial investment. The version published in Bloom's description in that 1672 ends on an upbeat tone. The prices for cocoa had recently been higher than ever because this last year their crops were blasted. Despite this problem, farmers on the island remained optimistic about the crop. Even in 1675, Modiford's local agents could find a taker for sharecropping lease for his cocoa estate, which reserved 90% of the yield of the existing trees to Sir Thomas. Instead, the blight continued, wiping out all the estates on the south of the island. Contemporaries laid the blame on a comet. Cocoa did survive on the small plantations on the north side of the island, which would provide the source for Dr. Sloane's nutritious health drink. But unable to secure transplants of fresh stocks from Spanish Venezuela, the island's major cocoa walks could not be replanted. By default, Anglo-Jamaican society and economy that was being built on cocoa and other crops became one founded on sugar alone. This shift in economic priorities altered the demands for labor and for land. The establishment of the Royal Africa Company's depot in Jamaica in 1673 would always have benefited deeper-pocketed investors. Now it helped sustain the expanding sugar estates. In this transition, small holdings, that colonial ideal for imperial policymakers who desired locally based militias, proved attractive acquisitions for sugar proprietors because they included cleared land. Jamaican farmland was not equal, and this even includes the flat bits. Sugar planters recognized two types of soil: the heavy clay plains of the island savannas and the rich, dark soils under its dense woods. Plantations needed grazing lands for their livestock, but grew sugar on former woodland. Clearing tropical forest required back-breaking effort and time. The sugar plantations' heavy investment in equipment for milling and boiling canes added an extra dynamic. To make the most of their outlay, planters desired whatever scraps of cleared land lay nearby to plant yet more canes, feed their mills, and meet their mortgages. At a local level, the small plots cocoa planters had cleared tempted their neighbors. The 1670s then reinforced existing trends towards sugar. Although the island continued to produce indigo and cotton, both crops were less competitive with sugar. The 1674 inventory for a large estate near the east bank of the Yalas River catches a further transfer. 18 indigo hooks remained among other old tools, but now they were piled in the curing house, along with 300 sugar pots, again, as we saw in the last paper. The transitions hit Jamaica as well. Cotton also retreated. By the 1680s, only one estate was growing cotton on the south side of the island. Perhaps coincidentally, it was the first estate on the south side to have a slave uprising. Sugar demanded expensive investment, but offered a safer bet. In 1670, Jamaica had around 60 sugar estates. 15 years later, in 1685, it had 246. The mixed economy that characterized Jamaica in the 1660s was challenged on several fronts. The consequences extended widely. Some early adjustments were administrative. To encourage continued immigration, the annual quit rents that landowners were supposed to pay on grants of crown land were slashed. Grants from Modiford stipulated 2 shillings and 6pence on 100 acres. Under his successor, the figure fell to a halfpenny, 1/60th of the previous total. In 1675, the incoming governor raised the amount to 1 shilling, but the charges remained uncollected. Governors' resulting propensity to grant away the still unsettled areas of the island in substantial blocks reinforced the existing tendency towards consolidating estates. As a result, Jamaica remained an island with an internal frontier well into the 1740s, but its pre-existing network of large land grants cramped frontier settlement. Jamaica would not develop a Barbados-style pattern of small and medium-style estates. Instead, Jamaica had been reshaped into its distinct variant of the slave society even before yellow fever restricted its white population. And the practices of sugar would be taken for granted. Edward Long's History of Jamaica doesn't even mention cocoa. The transition to sugar did not prevent all innovation or development. And indeed, one can see the first developments of sugar grinding machinery and models for new windmills coming in the 1670s. We also see developments, and Jenny Anderson, I'm sure, will expand on them tomorrow, with new crops like mahogany, which complement sugar because instead of an empty hold, you can now fill it up with mahogany. But on the other hand, sugar was hostile or inhospitable to other new crops. One can see the desperate attempts and unsuccessful attempts to introduce cochineal, another Spanish high-value crop that had been planted, and they attempt to found a company. They put an earl on the board. They give a Beckford 20%, and it still fails. Coffee is introduced again in the 1720s, but it doesn't take off until the 1780s, even though it uses a different part of land on the steep slopes sugar can't use. And only then, when the caffeine-deprived customers of the former French planters in Saint-Domingue are desperate and will even buy Jamaican coffee. This essay explores the backdrop against which sugar became the dominant monocrop late in the European occupation of Jamaica, after experiments with a variety of other crops had been tried, and after a blight ended the great hope of cocoa to compete as an export crop. Only in retrospect did sugar's ascendancy seem self-evident. In the late 19th century, other crops, primarily banana, that classic backcountry peasant crop, and then coconut, became rooted in former sugar lands. In the 1930s, the bananas were devastated by a blight. Over the last 20 years, the cocoa palms, too, are devastated by another blight. When it comes to sugar's alternative, changing our story loop remains difficult.
Thank you very much to all three of our speakers for keeping to time. That allows us time for discussion, as we would all like, I'm sure. These are fascinating papers, and let me turn it over to the floor then for questions to any of our three speakers. Yes?
I guess it is. So I have one question for Bertie and one for Wim. The first question is whether you see, well, you could perceive what kind of task these slaves were performing, what sort of role, or if we could call it profession, they had. The late 17th, early 18th century Jesuit father Antonil in Brazil, he describes different functions that slaves would perform and others that required greater skill. They were performed by free men, either white, mulatto, or even black men. So if you could perceive, of course, maybe some slaves that had lower functions could have more knowledge about the higher functions, but they did not perform it. But whether we could make more sense of this very interesting narrative. The question to Wim goes more or less on the same way, but the other way around. If you could see any of the sugar bakers, sugar refiners, that would come from Europe to the Americas, since the refinery process was very much similar to the production process, especially in its critical and more delicate phases, and that could also explain how this technology transition took place. Thank you.
Is that better? Yes. So thank you for the question. Yeah, and it's a good one. I think what's interesting about this moment is I think it's a period of transition, because one of the more interesting aspects of your question is the fact that these tasks, the roles slaves played, changed over time, and typically, yeah, certainly in the later period, in the real developed plantation period of the 18th century, I think it was unusual to see slaves. They certainly did a lot of, obviously, the cultivation of the crop, the harvesting of the crop, a lot of the field work in the actual place where the mills where the cane was crushed. They would do a lot of the manual labor there, and then work on producing the muscovado, overseeing the cauldrons, skimming the cauldrons, because what they skimmed off the top of the cauldrons was integrated, putting what was left from the sixth cauldron into the molds, that kind of thing. But none of the higher level kind of management work was necessarily done by slaves. Although I have seen planter manuals that say overseers can be, they can be slaves if they're particularly trustworthy, and if the manager knows them well. Distilling, of course, is another absolutely integral aspect of milling and plantation work. And there again, the workers were by and large enslaved. There was no. Interesting that one of the manuals I've read in terms of rum production is that it was advised that women do it as opposed to men, because women were more trustworthy and wouldn't simply drink the product at the end. But I think what's key about this moment of transition, it's clearly, well, if we can trust du Tertre, because of course there's always questions about that. And he tells a story. I was talking about it with somebody I had dinner with last night. Further on in du Tertre's account, he talks about witnessing the slave actually learning the skill by witnessing a chicken with wet feet walking through sugar. And maybe you're familiar with the story as well. I think it's kind of expanded, and I think that largely is probably apocryphal. But I think the basic argument holds true, and that is it was the slaves coming up with the Dutch who really knew how to clay sugar, how to make the molds, and that skill was passed on at that point. Oh, right, about the chicken with the wet feet. Right.
Okay, so your question to me was about refiners coming from the Dutch Republic to Brazil or Guyana, wherever the Dutch had their sugar plantations, and informing them about refineries. We don't have any proof of that, but there is something else, and that is that there are certain planters in Dutch Brazil, and I remember one man, Isaac de Ragier, whose in-laws in Amsterdam have a refinery. And this man obviously shipped his sugar to Europe, but we don't have his correspondence. But there's so much of a coincidence. And I think there are probably one or two other examples that I've come across of people in whose families were refineries, but who themselves had plantations in Brazil.
Fortunately or unfortunately, I cut the page that gave the breakdown of how many slaves you needed for a cocoa plantation, and basically it's about a dozen is what Modiford recommended, with 4 indentured laborers and 1 overseer. So they're much smaller units, and the closer, yes, it is the changing transformation of the ratios and the construction of separate slave lines can be seen that way. Though it's also happening in Virginia and tobacco and in other crops in the late 17th century. The pottery, we haven't got enough rural pottery to have a good sample yet. In part, the numbers of the enslaved is changing, and from the late 17th century, you have yellow fever wiping out cutting down the ratios as well. So these are going to change. And in the 18th century, you'll find a lot more of the crafts being taught on the estates. But basically, yes, the death of cocoa in Jamaica is the route not traveled, and the construction of basically the island where, and I'm trying to remember Leslie's phrase, that they are more cruel than anywhere else.
think that's actually a really useful addition to this, because of course, the more I read about sugar production, I realize how complicated it was even at the very beginning. And I think you're absolutely right. It was a question of different people knowing different things. So even if you knew how to clay sugar, that doesn't mean you would have known how to, plant it, cut it, do any of the other things. And so it's not simply a coincidence that people were moving together, but it really was kind of a unit. And certainly the reverse holds true as well. People who knew how to cultivate and cut didn't necessarily know the refining methods. So yeah, point well taken.
I think it's a very good point, and I think this also extends to the system of production. So you remember Stuart Schwartz last night referring to a petition by Suriname planters of 1669, 2 years after the Dutch takeover of Suriname, where you have these planters referring in a petition to lavradores. They say we have to import workers from Europe because in due course they will make good lavradores, and these are these intermediate people in the sugar production system in Brazil. So at that point in time, in the very beginning, the infancy of Dutch Suriname, there are planters on the ground who think about introducing the Brazilian system of production that is not based solely on white masters and black slaves, but is this intermediate group of lavradores. In the end, that system is not adopted. Why is it not adopted? It's likely that the British model, which already was practiced on the ground, won out. We don't know how it won out, but again, you have these two systems of knowledge that are competing. In the end, one becomes dominant.
There's a third area of knowledge to bear in mind on these estates, and particularly reinforced by your comments about the Portuguese style of devolving foodstuffs and survival to the enslaved, is that you need knowledge of how to eat the local crops. The classic example is in Barbados history, where Captain Powell brings in a band who'd formerly lived, or whose ancestors had lived, in Barbados and brings them back. And then they get an absolutely rotten deal, and about 7 survivors totter home 20 years later. But there is the transfer of knowledge of how to produce cassava, which is after all poisonous, of what medicines to use, the contrast between, bringing a Scot in as your doctor isn't always very clever in a yellow fever zone. And the attempts to get local medical knowledge is there. There's also a couple of descriptions by an early 19th century physician of what happens when a group of slaves are transferred from one estate to another, and it's down by the coast, and they don't know what to eat because they've been eating the mountain plants. And I think we should look at the development of local knowledge, of local skills and survival skills in a place like the islands where survival was really very difficult.
Could I just add before the next question that I recommend you for the history of medicine. There's a paper in the Social History of Medicine recently by Pablo Gomez that touches these questions about how many different groups, ethnic groups and networks were involved in developing the medical cultures of the Caribbean. I think so. Knowledge coming from all over the world to try to deal with these blights and fevers and everything else that are mentioned. So, sorry to interrupt. Next question, yes.
Well, to answer this question for the Dutch, I think the answer is pretty clear that the Dutch were familiarized with sugar cultivation in what was a Portuguese colony, which of course happened to be under the umbrella of the Habsburg king, but it was still a Portuguese colony. And then later on, they were refamiliarized with sugar production in Suriname, which was an English colony. So despite the fact that, let's say, Curacao is just off of Venezuela, there was no, as far as we know, transfer of Spanish sugar know-how to the Dutch colonies.
I think we have to pay attention too to the fact that we're limited to some degree by the sources, and sources, as we've learned, I think very valuably in the first session, are certainly the kind of sources that I'm drawing on are a literary genre in and of themselves, and I think that the convention developed to really draw attention to the role of the Dutch coming out of Brazil. Not necessarily because that's the only way that the French learned how to make sugar, but it's just kind of repeated. People were repeating this kind of literary genre that liked to draw attention to this moment. Now on Martinique and Guadeloupe, the Spanish had been there. As you say, they were close, and on Hispaniola, of course, with the kind of semi-clandestine settlements that developed in the 17th century before France was given Saint-Domingue in 1697, they tended to stay far away from the Spanish as they could, and that's relatively a large island. So, but nonetheless, there must have been some kind of transfer. That's certain. Like I said, there isn't this kind of explicit pointing of the finger to the Spanish that there is to the Dutch and to the Portuguese, though.
I'd be tempted to say one answer is religion. You are in religious wars and religious hostility. And certainly in the conquest of Jamaica, when a African-Jamaican sugar boiler is used as an intermediary, he's then hanged afterwards pour en courage. And so we have a set of examples of non-connection. On the other hand, the development of how to process cocoa may be an example of where there was connections, and there's a loud silence on that happening. You don't write about dealing with the Spaniards, it doesn't look well. I do note the only example of a Spanish tradesman I found in early Barbados is unfortunately a fisherman. He then runs away just after Western design because it looks suspicious. So there may have been transfers, but it's difficult to find the names, and the places you might expect them to happen don't. It does look with the English army in Hispaniola that nobody wanted to join such a bunch of losers. Similarly, when they land in Jamaica, within, I think, 3 months of the English being there, the slaves who join the English, they're having to chain up the last 6 because all the rest have run away to the mountains. So it didn't always look a good deal.
Yes, in the back?
I know very little is the basic answer, so I'll tell that. A couple of inventories mention cocoa cloths, so presumably something's happening there. I think it is being exported dry. You wouldn't want it shooting in the crops. I know little more than that. It does sound, actually, from Modiford's guidelines for how to plant, as if it's assuming that you will have cocoa nuts and be able to plant them in use. So there's probably fresh are being circulated as seed, but most, I presume, are being dried on the island and then shipped out for processing in London.
Well, I asked because, of course, the French island is until very recently had a pretty active cocoa production system. And in Montserrat, where I worked, there was a lot of co-processing of cacao. And well, maybe I'll have time to say something about that in my paper, but probably not.
There was a question? Yes.
I
see it primarily through the union movement. It's the sugar belt at one level is seen as a key sector, the supporters of the major trade unions, the area that the trade unions are fighting over, and then giving you discussions, how far should it be propped up? What a pity we didn't manage to sell off the government sugar company to the Brazilians before the currency collapsed, and so on. So there's that debate about work and a history of active, angry work. There's also a second tradition about the sugar belt also being the area with the highest illiteracy rates still, and that sort of set of problematics of sociology. I think because sugar is still there and still seen as an industry with a future, it's not yet being investigated enough as an industry with a past.
In terms of Martinique and Guadeloupe, both departments have a number of museums devoted to the history of slavery and the history of sugar making, Musée de la Canne, both islands. My sense is, though, the way this history is represented in these museums tends to fall back on a bipartite, white planter, black slave model. So I do think that is a potential for the kind of work that I'm doing in talking more about the role of slaves in terms of carrying skilled knowledge, not simply manpower, not simply labor power, but at looking, or, as Eric pointed out in his comment, the fact that knowledge isn't a singular thing, that it's carried by different people that work together in kind of shifting models. One thing, actually, just to get back to that, and actually to pick up on Danielle Stroom's first question to Stuart Schwartz yesterday, when you tried to bring in the Atlantic Islands, and I think that hasn't been talked about yet and should be when we're looking at models of plantations, and certainly the evolution of the Portuguese model that was not so much focused on slaves, but had, the Portuguese in large kind of family groups were really the workers. Slaves, when they worked, would be working, devising irrigation systems, working as domestic servants, not necessarily in slaves, in fields. And I think it's important to see the evolution of that as it crosses the Atlantic. And a lot of people have paid attention to it, but we haven't really talked about it today. So the models that Eric raised of different people knowing different things, I think has to be underlined constantly. And that could go quite a distance, I think, to making some of these museum exhibits a little bit more engaging or interesting.
I would say that sugar in Suriname is usually associated with slavery. You cannot separate the two. And that has made, of course, for a very strained relationship with the former mother country. Suriname became independent in 1975. And what's happened since then is interesting in itself, because by now there are more Surinamese living in the Netherlands than there are in Suriname, which also means that that's been translated into an interesting intellectual culture among Surinamese and Antillean intellectuals in the Netherlands, who have finally, in the last quarter century, brought slavery as a major issue to the fore. So that is a discussion that is still going on. I won't go into detail, but this very week there are major discussions, as you may have seen in the international press, about this. But there's also, to give you one example, there's a movie in the cinemas right now about sugar and slavery, which is drawing large audiences. So this is an issue that doesn't go away. So it's an issue about slavery, but slavery, when it is portrayed, it's always sugar. It's the sugar plantation.
I think we're coming to an end. I encourage you to come up and speak with the speakers one-on-one and continue the conversation after lunch, but we'll have a break for that now. Thank you.